This work is not about assigning blame, promoting stereotypes, or suggesting that any group is inherently destined for success or failure. Instead, it explores a more difficult and important question. How do repeated experiences of adversity shape the human mind across generations? Psychology has long shown that people adapt to the environments they inhabit. When those environments are stable, supportive, and predictable, individuals often develop habits and beliefs that encourage long-term planning, trust, confidence, and resilience. When environments are marked by chronic stress, instability, discrimination, violence, or limited opportunity, the mind adapts differently. These adaptations are not signs of weakness. They are often survival strategies that helped people cope with the realities they faced. Many of the concepts explored in these pages, intergenerational trauma, learned helplessness, scarcity, stereotype threat, reduced social capital, chronic stress, and self-reinforcing expectations, are not unique to any race, ethnicity, or nation. Similar psychological patterns have been observed among people affected by war, famine, political oppression, generational poverty, forced migration, and other forms of prolonged adversity throughout history. The focus on Black Americans reflects a particular historical and social context, not a claim that these psychological processes belong exclusively to one community. Within every population, there are extraordinary stories of resilience, achievement, and perseverance, just as there are individuals who struggle. Human beings are never defined solely by their circumstances. The purpose of this work is to understand how the mind adapts to repeated hardship, how those adaptations can be passed through families and communities, and how behaviors that once increased the chances of survival can later become obstacles to thriving in different environments. Most importantly, this book argues that while history influences the present, it does not imprison the future. Psychological patterns are powerful, but they are not destiny. They can be understood, challenged, and with time, transformed. The goal, therefore, is not to judge people for the ways they have adapted, but to understand those adaptations with honesty, compassion, and scientific curiosity. Only by understanding the forces that shape human behavior can individuals, families, and communities begin to build new patterns that create different futures. Why do two people who possess similar intelligence, talent, and determination often end up living completely different lives? For generations, this question has been answered in simplistic ways. Some argue that success is purely a matter of personal responsibility. Others insist that circumstances alone determine outcomes. Both perspectives contain elements of truth, but neither tells the whole story. Human behavior is far more complex. Every day, millions of people wake up believing they are making independent choices. They decide where to work, what to study, who to trust, how to spend their money, and what goals are worth pursuing. Yet beneath every decision lies an invisible psychological framework shaped by years, sometimes generations of experience. Our minds are not created in isolation. They are built through repeated interactions with families, neighborhoods, schools, workplaces, institutions, and communities. They absorb patterns. They learn what is safe and what is dangerous. They learn what effort usually produces. They learn who can be trusted, what opportunities feel attainable, and whether tomorrow is worth planning for. The remarkable strength of the human mind is its ability to adapt. A child raised in an unpredictable environment develops different psychological strategies than one raised in stability. Someone who repeatedly encounters uncertainty may become highly alert to danger. Someone who experiences persistent scarcity may focus on today's problems before tomorrow's possibilities. Someone who grows up surrounded by encouragement may develop confidence that effort will be rewarded, while someone who repeatedly experiences disappointment may gradually begin to expect failure before they even begin. These adaptations are not signs of intelligence or ignorance, strength or weakness. They are the brain doing what it evolved to do, learning from experience and preparing for the future it expects. The tragedy is that the same psychological adaptations that help people survive one environment may become barriers in another. A mindset that promotes vigilance in dangerous surroundings can become chronic anxiety in peaceful ones. A deep distrust that once protected a family from genuine injustice can make it difficult to engage with institutions that also offer opportunity. A focus on immediate survival, perfectly rational during times of scarcity, can make long-term planning feel like an impossible luxury. Repeated setbacks can slowly teach a person that effort no longer matters, even when new opportunities begin to appear. Over time, these patterns can become self-reinforcing. Expectations shape behavior. Behavior influences outcomes. Outcomes strengthen expectations. What begins as an adaptation to circumstance can gradually become part of a person's identity. This book explores that process. It examines how psychological patterns emerge, how they are strengthened through families and communities, and how they influence motivation, decision-making, relationships, ambition, and achievement. The chapters ahead explore concepts such as intergenerational trauma, learned helplessness, scarcity, chronic stress, reduced social capital, institutional trust, stereotype threat, and self-reinforcing expectations. Each concept reveals a different piece of the puzzle, but together they tell a larger story. The human mind is profoundly shaped by the environments in which it develops. Although this book often discusses Black Americans because of the unique historical experiences of slavery, segregation, discrimination, and continuing inequality in the United States, the psychological principles explored here are universal. Similar patterns have been observed among communities affected by war, famine, political oppression, forced migration, generational poverty, and other forms of prolonged adversity across the world. This is not a book about victimhood, nor is it a book about excuses. It is a book about understanding. Understanding why capable people sometimes struggle to reach their potential. Understanding why behaviors that appear irrational often become understandable when viewed through the lens of psychology. Understanding how beliefs, expectations, and environments interact to shape lives. Most importantly, it is a book about possibility. One of the most encouraging discoveries in modern psychology is that the human brain remains capable of change throughout life. Expectations can be revised, habits can be replaced, trust can be rebuilt. New environments can foster new ways of thinking. Supportive relationships can alter life trajectories. The very adaptations that once served survival can be reshaped to support growth. History matters, environment matters, opportunity matters. Individual choices matter. None of these forces acts alone. To understand human behavior, we must resist the temptation to search for simple explanations. Instead, we must appreciate the complex interplay between biology, psychology, family, culture, institutions, and lived experience. This book is an invitation to make that journey, not to judge, not to condemn, but to understand, because understanding is where meaningful change begins. Chapter 1: Intergenerational Trauma. The key point from psychology is that intergenerational trauma is not the idea that trauma is genetically passed down in a deterministic way. Rather, traumatic experiences can influence how people think, feel, parent, and respond to stress, and those patterns can affect the next generation. Social conditions can reinforce those patterns over time. Imagine that a person experiences years of severe, uncontrollable stress. The brain adapts to help them survive. Over time, several things can happen. The brain becomes highly alert to danger, hypervigilance. Trust becomes difficult because betrayal or unfair treatment has been common. The stress response activates more easily and takes longer to calm down. Emotional expression may become more restricted because showing vulnerability once carried risks. Parenting may become more focused on protection than exploration or independence. These adaptations are not signs of weakness. They are often effective survival strategies in threatening environments. The challenge is that a strategy that helps someone survive one environment may not be optimal in a safer one. Children learn not only from what parents say, but also from what they observe. For example, if a parent has learned that authority figures are dangerous, they may unintentionally teach, don't trust people, keep your guard up, don't expect fairness. Success can be taken away at any moment. Even if those lessons were once adaptive, they can shape a child's worldview before the child has had their own experiences. Psychologists sometimes describe this as the transmission of beliefs, emotional regulation styles, and coping strategies across generations. Chronic stress also affects parenting in practical ways. Parents under constant financial strain or fear often have less mental bandwidth. This can lead to more reactive discipline, less patience, fewer emotionally available conversations, greater emphasis on obedience than curiosity. Again, these are understandable responses to difficult circumstances rather than evidence of poor character. Psychology also interacts with the environment. Suppose two children have similar abilities. One grows up where adults expect college, no professionals, and have financial cushions. The other grows up where unemployment, unstable housing, or violence are common. Their beliefs about what is realistic may diverge, not because of innate ability, but because expectations are shaped by repeated experience. This is related to concepts like self-efficacy, belief that one's actions can influence outcomes, and learned expectations. Consider a fictional family spanning 4 generations. First generation James, born in the 1930s. James grows up in the American South during legal segregation. He witnesses racial violence, sees neighbors intimidated for attempting to vote, and learns that speaking up can carry serious consequences. Psychologically, he develops a simple rule: stay quiet, stay safe. That rule helps him survive. Second generation Robert, born in the 1960s. James raises Robert. James loves his son deeply, but rarely expresses affection. Instead, he emphasizes discipline. Whenever Robert questions authority, James quickly shuts him down. From James's perspective, this is protection. He believes, if my son argues with the wrong person, he could get hurt. Robert grows up interpreting his father's strictness as emotional distance. He learns, don't show weakness, don't trust outsiders, keep emotions inside. Third generation, Marcus, born in the 1990s. Marcus never experiences legal segregation himself. However, he notices his father avoids banks, distrusts government agencies, and expects disappointment. Marcus absorbs these attitudes without fully realizing it. At school, when he encounters setbacks, he is more likely to think, maybe people like me aren't expected to succeed. This belief can reduce persistence, not because Marcus lacks intelligence, but because expectations influence motivation. Psychologists have long studied how expectations affect effort, confidence, and resilience. Fourth generation. Marcus eventually attends therapy and he begins recognizing patterns. He asks his father, why were you always so hard on me? His father answers, my dad taught me. That's how you kept your children alive. For the first time, Marcus realizes that what felt like emotional coldness began as fear. He decides to parent differently. He still teaches caution, but he also teaches confidence. He hugs his children. He encourages questions. He talks openly about emotions. The trauma is not erased, but its transmission is interrupted. Not every family affected by historical oppression experiences intergenerational trauma in the same way. Many families maintain strong emotional bonds, resilience, cultural traditions, and adaptive coping despite adversity. Likewise, many people from other backgrounds experience intergenerational trauma stemming from war, famine, abuse, forced displacement, or severe poverty. The psychological principle is broader than any one group. People adapt to the environments they face, and those adaptations can be passed on through family relationships and social learning. They can persist across generations, but they are not immutable. Supportive relationships, economic opportunity, effective mental health care, stable communities, and intentional parenting can all help reshape those patterns over time. Chapter 2. Learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is one of the most influential concepts in psychology because it explains how capable people can gradually stop trying, not because they are lazy or unintelligent, but because their brain has learned that effort and outcome are disconnected. It is also important to emphasize that psychologists view learned helplessness as a possible response to repeated, uncontrollable adversity, not as an inherent characteristic of any racial, ethnic, or social group. Many people exposed to the same circumstances do not develop it, while others do. The theory was first developed by psychologist Martin Seligman in the late 1960s. The basic idea is simple. Imagine your brain is constantly asking one question: does what I do actually matter? If the answer is repeatedly yes, your brain develops agency. You begin to think, if I study harder, I'll improve. If I work overtime, I'll probably earn more. If I keep applying, eventually I'll find a better job. This creates confidence. Psychologists call this self-efficacy, the belief that your actions can influence your future. Now imagine the opposite. Every important effort seems to fail. You work hard. Nothing changes. You save money. A medical bill wipes it out. You apply for jobs. No one calls. You report a problem and nothing happens. After years of this, the brain starts drawing a different conclusion. Maybe nothing I do really matters. Notice the shift. The person doesn't stop because they're incapable. They stop because their brain has updated its prediction about reality. The brain dislikes wasting energy. Trying requires effort. If effort repeatedly produces no reward, the brain begins conserving energy. This is actually an adaptive process. From an evolutionary standpoint, repeatedly investing energy into unwinnable situations is inefficient. So the brain reduces motivation. The person experiences thoughts like, what's the point? It probably won't work. People like me don't get those opportunities. Why bother? To outsiders, this can resemble laziness. Psychologically, it is often closer to hopelessness. Over time, learned helplessness changes more than behavior. It changes identity. Instead of thinking, this situation is difficult, the person begins thinking, I'm the problem. Psychologists sometimes distinguish between these beliefs. A setback can be interpreted as temporary, things are bad right now. Specific, I'm struggling in this area. Controllable, I can improve. Or it can become permanent, nothing will ever change. Global, everything in my life is hopeless. Personal, I'm simply not capable. The second pattern is much more strongly associated with depression. One of the saddest aspects is that people often stop aiming before they stop dreaming. Imagine someone who once wanted to become an engineer, a lawyer, a business owner. After enough disappointments, the goal quietly changes. Not because they no longer want it, because they no longer believe it is realistic. Their dreams become smaller, not from lack of ability, but from repeated experiences that taught them large aspirations were unlikely to pay off. Consider a fictional man named Darnell. Childhood. Darnell grows up in a neighborhood where many adults work hard but remain financially unstable. His mother works 2 jobs. His uncle has been laid off several times. His grandfather often says, you can do everything right and still lose. As a child, Darnell notices something. Hard work doesn't always seem to produce security. Teenage years. At 16, he wants a part-time job. He applies everywhere. 20 applications, 30, 40. No response. Eventually, someone hires him. 3 months later, the business closes. His first lesson becomes, even when things finally work out, they don't last. Early adulthood. He enrolls in community college. His car breaks down. He misses classes. He falls behind. Then his mother becomes ill. He drops out to help pay the bills. Everyone tells him, "You should go back." He wants to, but his experience tells him, "Every time I try to move forward, something knocks me back." Notice what has happened psychologically. The obstacle isn't simply money, it's his growing expectation that effort will not reliably change outcomes. At 25, a friend encourages him to apply for an apprenticeship. Years earlier, he would have applied immediately. Now his internal dialogue sounds different. "They won't pick me. Someone else is more qualified. Why waste the time?" He never submits the application. The tragedy is that this rejection comes from inside rather than from the employer. The barrier has become psychological. One day, he meets an older supervisor named Angela. She notices that Darnell is capable but rarely volunteers. She asks, "Why don't you apply for promotions?" He shrugs. "They're going to choose somebody else." Angela replies, "How many times have you actually applied?" He pauses. "None." For the first time, he realizes something important. His expectation is based less on current evidence than on years of accumulated disappointment. Angela helps him prepare an application. He gets rejected, but instead of saying, "See, I knew it," she says, "Good. Now let's look at the feedback." 6 months later, he applies again. This time, he gets the job. That single success doesn't erase years of learned helplessness, but it weakens it. His brain starts to update its prediction. Effort can matter after all. Psychologists have found that learned helplessness is not permanent. It can be reversed, but it often requires repeated experiences that reconnect effort with outcome. This is why a good mentor can be transformative. A stable job with clear rewards can build confidence. Achievable goals can restore a sense of agency. Therapy, especially approaches that help people identify and challenge pessimistic explanatory styles, can reduce helplessness. In other words, people often need more than encouragement. They need credible experiences that demonstrate their actions make a difference. Learned helplessness does not mean people are giving up because they lack character. It describes a psychological adaptation to environments where outcomes have often seemed beyond one's control. Understanding it helps explain why two people with similar talents can respond very differently to setbacks. One sees a failure as temporary and tries again. The other, after years of uncontrollable adversity, concludes that trying is futile. That conclusion can become a self-fulfilling cycle unless new experiences restore a sense of agency and control. Chapter 3. Present-focused decision-making under scarcity. This is one of the most fascinating findings in modern psychology and behavioral economics because it challenges a common assumption that people in poverty simply make bad decisions. A growing body of research suggests that scarcity itself changes how people think. The issue is often less about intelligence and more about how the brain allocates its limited attention under chronic stress. One influential idea comes from behavioral economists Sendil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir, who argue that scarcity captures mental bandwidth. When a pressing need dominates your attention, it leaves fewer cognitive resources available for other tasks. Imagine you're carrying a heavy backpack every day. The backpack represents unpaid bills, overdue rent, an empty refrigerator, uncertainty about next month's income, a car that might break down, children who need clothes, debt collectors calling. Someone else without that backpack has more energy to think about. Retirement, investing, networking, education, starting a business, learning new skills. The difference is not necessarily intelligence, it's mental bandwidth. Scarcity acts as dozens of browser tabs open in your mind at once. Even if you're smart, too many competing demands slow everything down. Under chronic scarcity, the brain starts asking a different question. Instead of, "How can I improve my life over the next 10 years?" It asks, "How do I make it through this week?" That shift is psychologically adaptive. If your electricity might be shut off tomorrow, thinking about retirement isn't irrationally ignored. It simply becomes less urgent than keeping the lights on. The firefighting mindset. Imagine a firefighter. When a house is burning, they don't stop to think about repainting the walls next month. They put out the fire. Poverty can produce a similar cognitive state. Every day becomes another emergency. Rent is due. The car won't start. A child is sick. Work hours are cut. Food is running low. Life becomes an endless series of fires. Long-term planning keeps getting postponed, not because it isn't valued, but because something more immediate demands attention. This creates a vicious cycle. Because you're always solving today's crisis, you don't have the time or energy to prevent tomorrow's crisis. For example, someone can't afford to fix their car properly. Instead, they buy the cheapest temporary repair. 3 months later, the car breaks down completely. Now the repair is much more expensive. To an outside observer, buying the temporary fix may look short-sighted. From the inside, it was the only option they could afford at the time. The decision wasn't necessarily poor, it was constrained. Every financial problem requires decisions. Should I pay the rent, the gas bill, the internet, buy groceries, refill my prescription? People living comfortably make many of these choices automatically because they have enough resources to cover them. Someone experiencing chronic scarcity may make dozens of stressful financial decisions every week. Over time, this constant decision-making becomes mentally exhausting. The quality of decisions often declines simply because the person is depleted. Another psychological effect is how people evaluate risk. When life already feels unstable, immediate rewards often become more psychologically compelling than uncertain future gains. Imagine being offered option A, £20 today. Option B, £100 in 3 months. Someone with savings might easily choose £100. Someone whose cupboards are empty may rationally choose £20 because it solves today's problem. This isn't necessarily impatience, it reflects a different set of constraints. Consider a fictional woman named Keisha, age 27. Keisha works full-time at a supermarket. She earns enough to survive, but rarely enough to get ahead. Every month follows the same pattern. Week 1, rent. Week 2, utilities. Week 3, the car needs repairs. Week 4, her son needs new shoes. Every month ends with almost nothing left. Keisha wants to become a nurse. She researches evening classes. The tuition seems manageable. Then she notices something. Clinical placements require reducing work hours. She can't afford that. She closes the web page, not because she lacks ambition, because the numbers don't work. One morning she wakes up thinking about her overdraft, childcare, petrol, her landlord, a late electricity payment, whether she'll have enough food until payday. By 9 a.m., her mind has already been juggling multiple urgent problems. At work, her manager suggests taking an online certification course that could lead to a promotion. She smiles politely. Inside, she's thinking, I barely have enough energy to get through today. The course might improve her future, but her present is consuming all her attention. One afternoon, her washing machine breaks. Repair cost £180. She has £70. She puts it on a high-interest credit card. Someone watching from the outside might think, she should avoid credit card debt. She agrees. But she also needs clean clothes for work and for her son. The decision is constrained, not carefree. After several years, something changes. Her employer introduces a predictable work schedule, a small emergency savings program, and tuition assistance. Nothing about Keisha's intelligence changes. Nothing about her work ethic changes, but the constant emergencies begin to lessen. She has enough breathing room to think beyond the next week. She starts studying 1 evening each week, then 2. She completed her nursing qualification over several years. Looking back, she says, it wasn't that I suddenly became disciplined. I finally had enough room in my life to think about the future. Scarcity often compresses a person's time horizon. When resources are consistently insufficient, the brain prioritizes immediate survival because that is the most adaptive response to the circumstances. This can make long-term planning, saving, education, or career development much harder, not because those goals are unimportant, but because urgent needs continually crowd them out. This perspective does not mean everyone facing poverty will make the same choices, nor does it deny personal responsibility. People differ in resilience, support systems, and opportunities. Rather, it highlights that behavior is shaped by context. When chronic scarcity eases through a more stable income, fewer emergencies, stronger social support, or access to opportunities, many people naturally shift from a survival mindset toward a planning mindset, demonstrating that the capacity for long-term thinking was there all along. It had simply been competing with the demands of immediate survival. Chapter 4. Low Institutional Trust. This is one of the more subtle forms of intergenerational influence because it is not simply about whether an institution is trustworthy. It is about how repeated experiences, personal, family, or community-wide, shape a person's expectations of institutions before they ever interact with them. From a psychological standpoint, trust is built through repeated experiences of fairness, competence, and predictability. Conversely, repeated experiences of unfairness or mistreatment can make distrust a rational expectation. It's also important to distinguish between healthy skepticism and global distrust. Healthy skepticism evaluates each institution on its own merits. Global distrust assumes that most institutions are likely to disappoint or exploit you, even before evidence is available. Psychologists often think of trust as the brain answering a simple question. Is this system likely to help me, ignore me, or harm me? Your answer isn't based only on your own experiences. It also comes from stories told by parents and grandparents, what happened to friends, news coverage, community norms, repeated observations over time. The brain is constantly collecting evidence and building expectations. One of the brain's primary jobs is prediction. Imagine touching a hot stove. The next time you see a stove, your brain automatically becomes cautious. It doesn't wait to be burned again. The same predictive process applies to institutions. If someone's experiences consistently suggest authority figures are unfair, complaints are ignored, applications are rejected without explanation, or systems seem stacked against them, their brain begins predicting similar outcomes in future interactions. The expectation forms before the interaction even begins. Distrust can initially be adaptive. Suppose a child repeatedly hears, "Don't tell people your business. Be careful dealing with banks. Don't expect the police to help. Government doesn't care about people like us." If these messages were shaped by genuine experiences in previous generations, they may have developed as protective advice. The challenge is that the same caution can also discourage engagement with institutions that sometimes do provide valuable opportunities. Psychologists describe a process called confirmation bias. Once people expect institutions to fail them, they naturally pay more attention to experiences that confirm that belief. For example, a positive interaction with a doctor may be viewed as an exception. A negative interaction reinforces the broader expectation. Over time, the belief becomes increasingly resistant to change because the mind selectively notices confirming evidence. This tendency is not unique to institutional trust. It is a common feature of human cognition. Perhaps the most important psychological point is this: distrust changes behavior before anything happens. Someone who expects rejection may never apply for financial aid, avoid opening a bank account, skip preventative medical care, avoid speaking with teachers, decline counseling, hesitate to report crimes. To an outside observer, this can appear like disengagement. Internally, it often feels like self-protection. Living with chronic distrust is mentally exhausting. Every interaction requires extra vigilance. Questions constantly run through the mind. What are they really trying to do? What's the catch? Can I trust this information? Will this come back to hurt me? That constant monitoring increases stress and can make even ordinary bureaucratic tasks feel emotionally draining. Imagine a fictional man named Anthony. Anthony's grandfather served in the military. after returning from the segregated South. When he later tried to access benefits and housing programs, he believed he was treated unfairly and often spoke bitterly about government agencies. Throughout Anthony's childhood, he repeated, "Don't rely on the government." Anthony's mother had several frustrating experiences with landlords, public offices, and healthcare providers. She often felt dismissed or unheard. She began saying, "Nobody listens until something goes wrong." Anthony absorbed these comments long before he formed his own opinions. Whenever official letters arrived, they were associated with anxiety. Bills, benefit reviews, debt notices, court documents, institutions became linked with stress rather than support. Without anyone explicitly teaching it, Anthony's brain formed an association. Institutions equals problems. At 23, Anthony develops persistent chest pain. Friends tell him to schedule an appointment. He delays for months, not because he enjoys being sick. Part of him expects they probably won't take me seriously. When he finally goes, the doctor is attentive and refers him for treatment. Anthony is surprised. His expectation had been shaped more by years of anticipation than by this individual experience. A few years later, his employer encourages workers to open retirement accounts. Anthony hesitates. He remembers hearing stories throughout childhood. "They'll find a way to take your money. They don't help people like us." He leaves the paperwork untouched. The result is that he misses years of employer matching contributions, not because he lacks intelligence or discipline, but because distrust led him to disengage from an opportunity. Years later, Anthony's daughter brings home university financial aid forms. His first instinct is to say, "Forget it. They make it impossible." Then he catches himself. He realizes he is about to pass on an expectation that originated before he was born. Instead, he says, "Let's sit down and fill these out together." It takes several evenings. She qualifies for support. Anthony experiences something powerful. His brain receives new evidence. Not every institution behaves as he expected. His trust doesn't become blind, but it becomes more flexible. Psychologically, rebuilding trust is difficult because trust develops through repeated, consistent experiences, not a single positive interaction. It often requires institutions behaving fairly over time, transparent communication, respectful treatment, and individuals accumulating enough positive experiences to revise their expectations. Likewise, people can cultivate what psychologists sometimes call calibrated trust, neither assuming every institution is trustworthy nor assuming everyone is hostile. That means evaluating each situation on its own evidence rather than relying solely on inherited expectations. The broader lesson is that low institutional trust is best understood as a learned expectation. In some contexts, it may have developed as a protective response to genuine experiences of unfairness. The challenge is that when generalized too broadly, it can reduce engagement with systems that also offer education, healthcare, financial security, and legal protections. Understanding this dynamic helps explain why trust and the absence of it can have lasting effects on opportunity without implying that those effects are inevitable or irreversible. Chapter 5. Identity Threat and Stereotype Threat. This topic is one of the most researched and, at times, debated areas in social psychology. The central idea is not that stereotypes determine a person's abilities. Rather, it is that being aware of a negative stereotype about a group you belong to can, in some situations, create enough anxiety or self-monitoring to interfere with your performance. This phenomenon is known as stereotype threat, a concept developed by psychologists Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson. Importantly, stereotype threat is a situational effect, not a permanent trait. It has been studied across many groups, not only racial groups, but also women in mathematics, older adults taking memory tests, first-generation college students, and others. Researchers continue to debate how large and how consistent the effect is across different contexts, but there is substantial evidence that it can influence performance under certain conditions, Psychologically, people don't just want to succeed. They also want to avoid confirming negative beliefs about groups they identify with. Imagine walking into an important exam. Normally, your mind is focused on questions like, how do I solve this problem? Under stereotype threat, another question appears. What if I prove the stereotype right? Now, your brain is doing two jobs simultaneously. It is solving the problem and monitoring itself. That second task consumes mental resources. One of the brain's most limited resources is working memory. Think of working memory as your mental whiteboard. It's where you hold information while solving problems. Suppose solving a difficult math question requires almost all of your working memory. If anxiety suddenly occupies part of that space, don't mess up. Everyone is watching. If I fail, they'll think people like me can't do this. There is less capacity left for the actual task. The person's intelligence hasn't changed. Their available mental bandwidth has. Under stereotype threat, people often become unusually aware of themselves. Normally, you simply give a presentation. Now you're thinking, how do I sound? Am I confirming stereotypes? Are people judging me? Did I make a mistake? What are they thinking? Psychologists sometimes refer to this as self-monitoring. Ironically, the harder people try not to make mistakes, the more mentally strained they can become. Anxiety narrows attention. This is useful if you're escaping danger. It's less useful when solving complex problems. The brain begins scanning for signs of threat instead of focusing fully on the task. This can lead to second-guessing, slower thinking, forgotten information, reduced concentration, increased mistakes. Identity becomes on trial. Most people have experienced walking into a situation where they felt they represented more than themselves. Maybe the only woman in the room, the only immigrant, the only older employee, the youngest manager, the only person from a particular ethnic background. The psychological pressure isn't simply, I want to do well. It's, I don't want my performance to reflect badly on my entire group. That's a much heavier burden. One poor performance becomes emotionally larger. Instead of thinking, I had a bad day, the person may think, people might think this confirms what they already believe. That possibility alone can increase stress before future performances. Imagine a fictional student named Malik. Malik loves mathematics. His teachers describe him as naturally gifted. He routinely earns excellent grades. Math is one of the few places where he feels completely confident. He earns admission to a highly competitive engineering program. On the first day, he notices something. Very few students look like him. No one says anything negative. No one is openly hostile. But he becomes aware that he stands out. Before the test, he overhears two students discussing admissions. One casually remarks, some people probably got in because of diversity programs. The comment isn't directed at Malik, but it lodges in his mind. As he begins the exam, a new thought appears. If I do badly, they'll assume I didn't deserve to be here. The first question is difficult. Normally, he'd move on calmly. Instead, his thoughts spiral. Why can't I remember this? Everyone else probably understands. I'm falling behind. Don't prove them right. His heart races. His hands tense. He rereads the same paragraph multiple times. The material is familiar, but his attention is divided between solving problems and managing anxiety. He finishes below his usual standard. Walking home, Malik isn't thinking about calculus. He's thinking about what his score means. Instead of saying, I had one difficult exam, he thinks, maybe I don't belong here. That belief begins affecting his confidence before the next exam even arrives. A professor notices Malik withdrawing in class. After a conversation, she says something unexpected. Almost everyone in this program experiences moments when they feel they don't belong. One exam doesn't define your ability. She also explains how stress and belonging can affect performance. For Malik, this is eye-opening. He had assumed his anxiety meant he lacked ability. Instead, he realizes it may reflect the pressure he was placing on himself. He begins studying in a supportive group, seeks feedback rather than interpreting setbacks as proof he doesn't belong, and gradually regains his confidence. His exam scores improve, not because he suddenly became more intelligent, but because less of his mental energy was consumed by self-doubt. Identity threat illustrates that performance is not determined solely by knowledge or skill. It is also shaped by context, expectations, and the meaning people attach to situations. When individuals feel that their identity is under evaluation, anxiety can compete with the cognitive resources needed to perform well. That does not mean stereotype threat affects everyone equally, nor does it explain all differences in performance. Many people excel despite being aware of stereotypes, and factors such as preparation, teaching quality, motivation, socio-economic conditions, and individual resilience often play much larger roles. Stereotype threat is best understood as one psychological influence among many that can, under the right circumstances, make it harder for capable people to demonstrate what they know. Chapter 6: Reduced Social Capital. This topic is particularly interesting because it shifts the conversation away from what a person knows to who they know who knows them, and what information flows through their social network. From a psychological perspective, social capital isn't simply about having connections. It's about how relationships shape beliefs, expectations, confidence, opportunities, and even identity. Importantly, reduced social capital is not unique to any racial or ethnic group. It can affect anyone who grows up in isolated communities, economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, or environments with limited exposure to high opportunity careers. What is social capital? Sociologists often distinguish between human capital and social capital. Human capital is what you know, your education, skills, experience, and abilities. Social capital is who you know and how those relationships provide information, trust, mentorship, and opportunities. Psychologically, social capital acts like an invisible bridge between potential and opportunity. Two equally talented people may have very different life trajectories simply because one has access to people who can open doors or provide guidance. One of the brain's most powerful abilities is normalization. Children don't compare their world to every possible world. They compare it to the world they see every day. If everyone around you is employed in professional careers, discussing university, investing, starting businesses, traveling for work, your brain begins treating those paths as ordinary. They become psychologically attainable. Now imagine the opposite. Everyone you know works hourly jobs. Very few people attended university. Nobody owns a business. Nobody works in medicine, engineering, finance, or law. Your brain doesn't conclude, those careers are impossible. Instead, it quietly concludes, those careers aren't part of my world. That subtle difference matters enormously. Before people pursue opportunities, they usually have to imagine themselves in them. Psychologists sometimes talk about possible selves, the mental images people have of who they could become. Your environment helps determine which futures feel realistic. If you've never met a doctor, an architect, a software engineer, a judge, or a successful entrepreneur, it's harder to picture yourself becoming one. Not impossible, just psychologically more distant. Many opportunities aren't publicly advertised. People hear about them because someone says, I know someone hiring. My company has internships. My cousin works there. My old professor can introduce you. These are examples of what sociologists call weak ties, acquaintances rather than close friends. Research by Mark Granovetta showed that these weaker connections often provide access to new information and opportunities precisely because they connect us to different social circles. Without these connections, people may never learn about opportunities that others take for granted. Mentors do more than teach skills. They change self-perception. A mentor can say, you belong here. Those four words can completely alter someone's psychological trajectory. People often borrow confidence from others before developing it themselves. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as social persuasion, one of the sources of self-efficacy identified by Albert Bandura. Suppose two graduates receive the same rejection letter. Graduate A calls an uncle. The uncle knows someone at another company. An interview is arranged. Graduate B knows nobody in that industry. The rejection feels final. Psychologically, repeated dead ends create discouragement. Repeated introductions create optimism, and the difference isn't just opportunity, it's an expectation. Imagine a fictional young man named Jamal. Jamal grows up in a neighborhood where nearly everyone works hard. His mother is a nursing assistant. His father drives delivery trucks. His neighbors are mechanics, warehouse workers, retail employees, and cleaners. These are honorable professions. But Jamal notices something he has never met: a lawyer, an engineer, an investment analyst, a software developer, or a corporate executive. Those careers exist mostly on television. Jamal enjoys computers. He teaches himself basic programming online. His teachers praise his ability. One asks, "Have you thought about applying for internships?" Jamal says, "I didn't know high school students could do that." His teacher realizes something. Jamal isn't lacking motivation, he's lacking information. Jamal earns admission to a good university. Many classmates grew up differently. They casually mention, "My dad introduced me to someone at a tech company. My aunt helped me prepare for interviews. My neighbor is a recruiter." Jamal listens quietly. Nobody in his family has ever worked in technology. When internship applications ask for referrals, he leaves the section blank. He sends out dozens of applications. Most receive no response. His confidence begins to fade. He wonders, maybe I'm just not competitive enough. One evening, he attends a local technology networking event almost by accident. He feels out of place. People seem confident, speak the industry's language, and exchange business cards with ease. He considers leaving. Then, an older software engineer notices him standing alone. They start talking. The engineer reviews Jamal's resume, points out several improvements, introduces him to colleagues, and encourages him to apply for an entry-level position. A few months later, Jamal receives an offer. Looking back, he realizes something important. His programming skills hadn't suddenly improved, his social network had. Jamal has become a senior engineer. A student from a background similar to his reaches out for advice. Jamal agrees to mentor him. As they talk, Jamal sees himself from years earlier. Before ending the conversation, he says, "You're probably more qualified than you think. You just haven't met enough people who can show you the path." For that student, the meeting doesn't merely provide information, it changes what feels possible. Reduced social capital is powerful because it affects both external opportunities and internal beliefs. Networks provide introductions, practical advice, role models, and encouragement, but they also shape what people perceive as normal and achievable. When individuals have limited exposure to people in high opportunity environments, they may underestimate the range of futures available to them, not because they lack talent, but because those futures have never felt psychologically close. The encouraging aspect is that social capital is not fixed. Mentorship, professional organizations, internships, alumni networks, community programs, and even one meaningful relationship can expand a person's network and alter their expectations. In that sense, social capital doesn't simply open doors. It can reshape how people think about themselves and the opportunities they are willing to pursue. Chapter 7. Norms shaped by local environments. This is one of the most nuanced topics in psychology because it illustrates a central principle. People adapt to the environments they repeatedly experience. From an evolutionary and psychological perspective, this is exactly what the human brain is designed to do. The challenge is that behaviors that are adaptive in one environment may become maladaptive in another. This does not imply that any neighborhood or community has a single culture or that everyone in it behaves the same way. Rather, When people spend years in environments with certain recurring conditions, high crime, economic instability, frequent conflict, or weak institutional support, some behavioral norms may become more common because they help people cope with those conditions. The brain is constantly asking, what kind of world do I live in? Then it builds habits accordingly. If the world is generally predictable and safe, the brain learns cooperate, delay gratification, trust people until proven otherwise, think long term, resolve conflict verbally. If the world often feels unpredictable or dangerous, the brain may learn different lessons. Stay alert, don't appear vulnerable. Respond quickly to threats, rely on yourself, prioritize immediate needs. Neither set of responses is inherently good or bad. They are attempts to match behavior to perceived reality. Psychologists often distinguish between objective reality and perceived reality. Your brain doesn't respond to statistics, it responds to what you repeatedly experience. Suppose a teenager grows up hearing gunshots several nights a week, seeing fights as common. Friends have been assaulted. The brain concludes, conflict is part of everyday life. Someone raised elsewhere may conclude, conflict is unusual. These expectations shape automatic behavior. In some environments where formal institutions are seen as ineffective or slow to respond, personal reputation can take on greater importance. If people believe the police will not reliably protect them, they may feel pressure to project strength and discourage others from seeing them as easy targets. That can lead to behaviors such as responding quickly to insults, avoiding displays of vulnerability, placing a high value on respect, and being cautious about showing fear. Psychologically, these behaviors can function as protective strategies. However, in other settings, such as workplaces or universities, those same responses may be interpreted as aggression or poor emotional regulation. The behavior itself has not changed, but the environment has. Children growing up in stressful environments often develop hypervigilance. Their brains become exceptionally good at detecting potential threats. They notice facial expressions, changes in tone of voice, body language, unusual sounds. This can be remarkably adaptive. The downside is that hypervigilance can persist in safer environments. The person remains prepared for danger even when none exists. That constant state of alertness is mentally exhausting. Imagine two neighborhoods. Neighborhood A, stable employment, low crime, reliable public services. People can reasonably expect that today's efforts are likely to benefit tomorrow. Neighborhood B, frequent instability, high turnover, economic uncertainty, safety concerns. People may place greater emphasis on immediate problems because the future feels less predictable. This is not irrational. If tomorrow feels uncertain, today's needs naturally become more psychologically important. Humans are deeply social, especially during adolescence. Young people constantly ask, what earns respect here? The answer depends on the environment. In one school, academic success may increase social status. In another, athletic ability may matter more. Elsewhere, being perceived as tough or socially connected may carry greater weight. The brain adapts to whichever behaviors are rewarded by the surrounding peer group. Imagine a fictional boy named Tyrell. Tyrell grows up in an apartment complex where arguments frequently spill into public spaces. His mother repeatedly tells him, always pay attention to who's around you. Don't let anyone think you're weak. Those lessons come from genuine concern for his safety. One day, another student bumps into him in the hallway and laughs. Tyrell immediately pushes him back. A teacher intervenes and asks, why didn't you just walk away? Tyrell genuinely doesn't understand the question. In his experience, walking away risks being seen as someone others can take advantage of. His response wasn't simply impulsive. It reflected the rules he had learned about staying safe. Tyrell earns a scholarship to a boarding school in a quieter area. The environment is completely different. Students debate disagreements calmly. Teachers expect eye contact and measured responses. At first, Tyrell struggles. When classmates interrupt him, he interprets it as disrespect. He responds sharply. Others see him as confrontational. He sees himself as defending his dignity. Both interpretations arise from different social norms. A basketball coach notices Tyrell's reactions. Rather than criticizing him, the coach asks, "What happens where you're from if you let someone disrespect you?" Tyrell explains. The coach listens and replies, "That made sense where you grew up. Here, people earn respect differently." For the first time, Tyrell considers that there might be multiple ways to protect himself. The coach doesn't ask him to abandon his confidence. Instead, he helps Tyrell expand his repertoire, learning when firmness is appropriate and when calm communication is more effective. Years later, Tyrell becomes a youth mentor. When a teenager reacts aggressively to a minor disagreement, Tyrell doesn't immediately label him as a problem. Instead, he recognizes the behavior as an adaptation that may have served the young person in another context. He teaches conflict resolution while also acknowledging the reasons those defensive habits developed. The concept of norms, shaped by local environments, reminds us that behavior is context dependent. People develop habits, emotional responses, and social expectations that fit the environments in which they spend the most time. Those adaptations may increase safety, status, or predictability in one setting while creating difficulties in another. This perspective avoids two common mistakes. The first is assuming that behaviors are simply products of individual character. The second is assuming that environments determine people's futures. In reality, people are capable of learning new norms when they enter new contexts, especially when they have supportive mentors, stable institutions, and opportunities to practice different ways of responding. The psychological challenge is often not unlearning old adaptations, but recognizing that what once helped you survive is not always what will help you thrive in a different environment. Chapter 8: Chronic Stress and Cognitive Load. This is one of the strongest and most consistent findings in psychology and neuroscience. Chronic stress doesn't simply affect mood, it can influence attention, memory, decision-making, sleep, emotional regulation, and physical health. The key idea is that the human brain evolved to handle short bursts of stress, not years of continuous stress. It's important to note that chronic stress can arise from many sources: persistent poverty, caregiving, unsafe neighborhoods, chronic illness, unstable employment, discrimination, war, or prolonged uncertainty. The underlying psychological processes are broadly similar regardless of the source. A simplified way to think about the brain is that it has two broad modes. Mode 1, growth. When life feels relatively safe, the brain can focus on learning, creativity, planning, curiosity, long-term goals, building relationships. And this is when people are most able to think strategically. Mode 2, survival. When the brain detects ongoing danger, its priorities change. Instead of asking, "How do I build a better future?" it asks, "How do I get through today?" That shift is adaptive in the short term. If your home is on fire, you shouldn't be thinking about your 5-year career plan. The problem comes when the brain never feels able to leave survival mode. When we perceive a threat, the body releases stress hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol. In the short term, they are useful. They help us react faster, notice danger, mobilize energy, and remember emotionally significant events. However, if these systems remain activated for months or years, they can begin to interfere with functions that support learning, planning, and emotional regulation. Research has linked prolonged stress with difficulties in concentrating, holding information in working memory, controlling impulses, sleeping well, and recovering emotionally after setbacks. These effects vary widely between individuals and are influenced by protective factors such as supportive relationships, exercise, sleep, and access to care. Cognitive load, the overloaded desk. Imagine your mind as a desk. A few papers are spread across it. There's plenty of room to work. Now imagine adding overdue rent, debt, an ill parent, fear of losing your job, neighborhood violence, discrimination at work, childcare concerns, lack of sleep. Eventually, the desk becomes so cluttered that there's hardly any space left to work on anything else. The brain hasn't become less intelligent, it has become overloaded. Psychologists call this cognitive load. When mental resources are consumed by ongoing stresses, fewer remain available for solving new problems. People under chronic stress often ask, "What's wrong with me? I never used to forget things." In many cases, nothing is fundamentally wrong. Their working memory is already occupied. Imagine trying to remember a phone number while someone is shouting questions at you. Your memory hasn't disappeared. It's competing with other demands. Emotional regulation becomes harder. Stress also affects patience. Suppose someone is carrying almost no psychological burden. A minor inconvenience, a slow checkout line, or a rude comment may be brushed off. Now imagine someone already overwhelmed by weeks of financial uncertainty, poor sleep, and caregiving responsibilities. That same inconvenience may trigger a much stronger emotional reaction. The event hasn't changed, their remaining emotional capacity has. People living in environments where they frequently anticipate danger often devote considerable mental energy to monitoring their surroundings. They may be constantly asking, "Who's behind me? Is this street safe? Will I lose my job? Will this bill bounce? What if something unexpected happens?" This vigilance can be protective, but it is also tiring. Attention devoted to scanning for threats is attention that cannot simultaneously be devoted to creativity, learning, or long-term planning. Complex decisions require mental bandwidth. Choosing between two retirement funds, planning a business, studying for an exam, negotiating a contract, all require sustained concentration. When the brain is exhausted, people are more likely to postpone difficult decisions, rely on familiar habits, choose simpler solutions, or avoid decisions altogether. These are common responses to mental overload, not necessarily signs of poor judgment. Imagine a fictional woman named Danielle, age 34. Danielle is a single mother of two. She works full-time in a warehouse. Every month feels uncertain. Her landlord has hinted that rent may increase. Her youngest child has asthma. Her car is unreliable. Her mother recently became ill. None of these problems is catastrophic on its own. Together, they rarely leave her mind. Danielle wakes at 5:30 a.m. Before getting out of bed, her mind has already cycled through the electricity bill, whether her son has enough medication, how much petrol is left, whether she'll be asked to work overtime, and whether she can afford groceries before payday. She hasn't even left the house. Her brain has already been working for an hour. Her supervisor explains a new inventory system. Danielle struggles to follow the instructions. She makes several mistakes. A co-worker quietly says, "You've seemed distracted lately." Danielle feels embarrassed. She used to learn quickly. What she doesn't realize is that much of her mental bandwidth is already committed to managing ongoing stress. Her daughter asks for help with homework. Danielle wants to help. Instead, she finds herself staring blankly at the page. She's mentally exhausted, not because she doesn't care, because her cognitive resources are depleted. Later that night, she forgets to pay an important bill she had intended to handle. She feels guilty, but forgetting is often a symptom of overload rather than indifference. Months later, Danielle receives a modest promotion with more predictable hours and a small pay increase. Around the same time, her children began receiving after-school support, reducing some childcare pressure. Within a year, something surprising happens. She starts reading again. She enrolls in an evening course. She remembers appointments more easily. She laughs more often. Friends comment, "You seem like your old self." Danielle replies, "I didn't become a different person. I finally stopped feeling like I was drowning every day." What changed wasn't her intelligence. It was the amount of mental space available for thinking beyond survival. One useful concept from psychology is allostatic load, the cumulative wear and tear on the body and brain from repeated or chronic stress. When the stress response is activated too often without sufficient recovery, it can gradually affect physical health, mood, attention, and cognition. The encouraging aspect is that many of these effects are at least partly reversible. When chronic stress decreases through greater financial stability, safer environments, supportive relationships, better sleep, effective therapy, or access to healthcare, people often regain mental clarity, emotional resilience, and planning capacity. In many cases, the abilities were never lost. They were temporarily obscured by the demands of persistent stress. The broader lesson is that chronic stress changes what the brain prioritizes. It shifts attention toward immediate survival, consumes cognitive resources, and makes complex thinking more difficult. Understanding this helps explain why capable people may struggle under prolonged adversity, while also highlighting that when the burden is reduced, many can recover much of their cognitive and emotional functioning. Chapter 9 is Self-Reinforcing Expectations. This is arguably one of the deepest ideas in psychology because it explores how beliefs about the future can gradually shape the future itself. The mechanism is not mystical or inevitable. Instead, expectations influence attention, motivation, effort, persistence, interpretation of setbacks, and willingness to pursue opportunities. Over time, these small differences can accumulate into very different life trajectories. It's also important to distinguish between real external barriers and internal expectations. Self-reinforcing expectations do not mean that people imagine discrimination or obstacles. Rather, repeated experiences of success or failure can shape what people come to expect, and those expectations can then influence future behavior. One of the brain's main jobs is prediction. Every day your brain asks questions like, is this worth trying? Will this person help me? Is this goal realistic? Will my effort pay off? Your answers are rarely random. They are based on experience. If your experiences repeatedly suggest hard work usually pays off, your brain predicts success is possible. If your experiences repeatedly suggest people like me rarely succeed, your brain begins making different predictions. Expectations change behavior before outcomes. This is the key psychological insight. People often think outcome leads to belief, but psychology often finds the relationship also works the other way. Belief to behavior to outcome. For example, a student believes, I'm probably going to fail. That belief changes how they study. They procrastinate, they give up sooner, they ask fewer questions. They avoid difficult problems. Their performance suffers. The poor result then appears to confirm the original belief. The expectation has become self-reinforcing. Another important mechanism is emotional protection. Imagine applying for a dream job. If you believe success is possible, rejection will hurt. If you convince yourself beforehand, I was never going to get it anyway, you reduce the emotional risk. Psychologically, lowering expectations can serve as a defense against disappointment. The downside is that it can also reduce effort and ambition. At first, a person thinks, I failed. Eventually, after repeated setbacks, that thought may become, I'm a failure. This is a profound psychological shift. The failure changes from describing an event to describing an identity. Once identity changes, behavior often follows, and people begin acting in ways that are consistent with who they believe they are. Humans naturally seek patterns. If someone expects rejection, they often become highly attuned to signs of rejection. They may overlook evidence that contradicts their belief. For example, 10 employers reject an application. One invites an interview. The person thinks that interview probably doesn't mean anything. The mind gives more weight to evidence that fits its existing expectations. Psychologists call this confirmation bias. Psychologists have also studied how expectations from teachers, managers, coaches, and parents can subtly influence performance. One classic example is the Pygmalion effect, associated with research by Robert Rosenthal and Lenore Jacobson. In some educational settings, when teachers expected certain students to improve, those students sometimes did improve more than expected. The proposed mechanisms included more encouragement, more patience, more challenging questions, and more constructive feedback. Although later research has found that these effects are generally modest and vary by context, the broader principle that expectations can influence interactions and opportunities has remained influential. Imagine a fictional boy named Andre. Andre is curious. He loves taking things apart. He constantly asks questions. One day he proudly shows a homemade science project. A relative laughs and says, "People from around here don't become scientists." The comment isn't intended to be cruel. It's presented as realism. Andre says nothing, but the sentence stays with him. Andre performs well in science. His teacher suggests entering a regional competition. His first thought isn't excitement, it's a doubt. Students like me don't win those things. He almost declines. The teacher encourages him to participate anyway. He finishes respectably but doesn't win. Instead of seeing this as an experience, Andre interprets it as confirmation. I knew I wasn't good enough. Andre studies engineering. Many classmates confidently apply for prestigious internships. Andre hesitates. He reads the requirements and thinks, they're looking for someone exceptional. He doesn't apply. Months later, he learns that several classmates with similar grades were accepted, not because they were necessarily more talented, because they submitted applications. Andre's expectation had quietly removed him from the competition before anyone else could. Andre gets a solid engineering job. His manager notices his work is excellent. One day she asks, "Why haven't you applied for the senior role?" Andre replies, "I'm not ready." She looks surprised. "You've been doing senior level work for almost a year." For the first time, Andre realizes something. His self-image hasn't kept pace with his actual ability. His expectations are still being shaped by messages he absorbed years earlier. His manager gives him increasingly challenging projects. She provides honest feedback, celebrates improvements, and points out concrete evidence of his competence. Over time, Andre's internal dialogue changes. Instead of, "People like me don't become leaders," he begins thinking, "I've solved difficult problems before. I can learn this too." Notice that his confidence isn't based on empty affirmations. It's grounded in repeated experiences of success and constructive feedback. His expectations become more realistic and more hopeful. Self-reinforcing expectations illustrate that beliefs and behavior continuously influence one another. Expectations shape what people attempt, how much effort they invest, how they interpret setbacks, and whether they persist after failure. Those behaviors then produce outcomes that can strengthen or weaken the original belief. However, the cycle can work in both directions. A series of small successes, supportive relationships, effective mentoring, or opportunities to demonstrate competence can gradually build a more positive expectation of the future. This is why psychologists often emphasize mastery experiences, completing challenging tasks, as one of the most powerful ways to increase confidence and self-efficacy. The broader lesson is not that thinking positively guarantees success. Reality includes genuine obstacles, luck, and structural factors beyond any individual's control. Rather, psychology suggests that expectations matter because they influence behavior in ways that can either narrow or expand a person's opportunities. When expectations become more accurate and are supported by real experiences of competence and growth, they can help create an upward spiral, just as pessimistic expectations can contribute to a downward one.